So let's begin talking about some designations regarding age. A number of students, and often we're faced with the question of what counts as childhood, what is a child, what is a young adult, what is adolescence, where is that cutoff? And so we want to talk about that in regards to Nancy Drew. Of all the child protagonists that we're reading about in this course, Nancy's actually among one of the oldest. In the 1959 revision of The Secret of the Old Clock, which again is the version that we're reading in this class, this is the 1959 edition. She was aged up. She was 16 in the original 1930 edition, and now she is 18. That's an adult to a lot of people's eyes. But in the eyes of psychologists and sociologists, Nancy is actually falling more into a liminal period known as emerging adulthood. For a long time, and in many cultures today, there existed this very hard barrier between childhood and adulthood. And once that threshold is passed, you're an adult. However, now due to the constant social shifting during the 20th century, the period of childhood began to become extended, which gave way to a new designation, adolescence. Again, in the West, at least in the past, once you hit 18, you were an adult. Sometimes it was due to legal designation, sometimes it's due to social responsibilities. But the term adolescence was created with the publication of G. Stanley Hall's Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relations to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education, a title that just rolls off the tongue, published in 1904. In this text, Hall positioned this new period of life as, quote, a turbulent period of physical, emotional, and sexual development during which youths needed to be shielded from adult duties and expectations, end quote. Hall saw children as incapable of reason and in need of strong discipline and punishment, that had moved beyond the savagery of childhood and had great potential, but were also liable to go astray. Modern concepts of adolescence is truly one of transition. Many place the age range somewhere between 12 and 21. Now, that may seem surprising in some ways, as it's entirely possible that some of you fall into that age range still yet. But the characteristics are still there for many college-age students as they're part of a transitional phase. Instead of like in the past, where once you became an adult through whatever age barrier of rite of passage was designated by your culture. Nowadays, there's more gradual transition from the relatively few responsibilities of childhood to the more autonomous adulthood of post-college years. One of the reasons adolescence, or young adulthood, as it's sometimes called, is due to its contradictory nature of how the rest of society views you. Expectations of behavior and capabilities vary wildly. You're expected to be mature, responsible, and self-sufficient, yet many expect much less of you. A teenager in high school is of course going to be frustrated when they're told on one hand that they should behave like responsible adults and do their own laundry, and yet told they can't stay out late because they're just a kid. So Nancy Drew gives us a glimpse of adolescence in popular fiction, especially adolescent femininity. Diana Bells Camper, writing for Girlhood Studies, explains, quote, depictions of teenage girls in American popular culture texts include stereotypical characteristics that highlight the paradoxical nature of their status. Adolescent femininity is rife with childlike innocence and ineptitude, as well as burgeoning sexual allure and maturity. To illuminate both facets, teenage girls are coded with identifiers that signify their youth and femininity, like clumsiness, obsession with fads, emphasis on their physiques, and romantic aspirations. And they're often the objects of dreams and fantasies for two targeted demographic markets: They become inspirational models for young girls and sexual targets for the adult male gaze. And yet, Kate Harper argues that the Nancy Drew series rejects many of the gendered assumptions and prescriptions of adolescence that were prominent at the time. Harper goes on to explain that during this time, adolescent girls in particular were increasingly vulnerable to moral downfall and what were known as sins of the flesh as their participation in public spaces increased. We see during the 1930s in popular text the prescriptive nature of fiction, works that, quote, accepted and promoted the assumptions and prescriptions of adolescence. Literature directed at children and adolescents was no exception. The majority of these texts acted as warning or cautionary manuals for boys and girls. However, as Harper points out, the Nancy Drew series appears to stand in stark contrast to this pattern of adolescent representation. She says that unlike most of the literature of its time, the Nancy Drew series features a female adolescent protagonist who is capable, level-headed, rational, and emotionally balanced, the direct opposite of the popular construct of adolescence. Nancy Drew operates almost completely without adult supervision and regularly engages in physically risky behavior, but never succumbs to depression or delinquency. Amy Boesky, in her essay, Solving the Crime of Modernity, Nancy Drew in 1930, places Nancy within the context of the shifting landscape of America heading into the Great Depression. She says that Hall's research on adolescence in the first decade of the 20th century coincided with complex socioeconomic changes leading to the gradual recognition of teenagers as a distinct demographic group. Perhaps the biggest factor in shaping American adolescence was the institution of high school. By the Depression, the age of compulsory attendance was raised again, this time to 16, partly to take adolescents out of the workplace and decrease competition for scarce jobs. American high schools helped to institutionalize adolescence and at the same time segregated adolescents from both younger children and from adults. Suddenly, older kids are expected to stay in school longer, and they had to construct these separate new buildings because they wouldn't fit in the old schools. And so you had this sort of petri dish that, of course, would create its own subculture. Boesky goes on to explain that literature for young readers, which is always seen as didactic in nature, shared with emerging sporting and educational programs the belief that adolescence provided new opportunities, but also presented new hazards. Adolescents needed to learn to monitor and control themselves, and literature could help to show them how. The sense that young people could go terribly wrong persisted in the public imagination. Modern life was believed to exacerbate these vulnerabilities. The protagonists of Stratemeyer's most successful series, including the Hardy Boys and the Nancy Drew Mysteries, embodied, as if by prescriptions, Hall's 8 optimal adolescent traits. Those traits are health and hygiene, superabundant energy, a willingness to be taxed or stretched, sympathy, love of nature, sublimation, activity, and loyalty or fidelity, both to self and to the community. Quite prescriptive in nature.